All right, let's go to the second part of this chapter. So this is 17B. This chapter is going to be just a series of 5 short videos. So it may seem like a lot because there's 5 of them, but they're only about 20 slides each. So bear with me. We've got 4 more to go, including this one. So we're going to talk about renal physiology. In the first section, we talked about anatomy. So the gross anatomy of the kidney, blood supply to and from the kidney, and then the nephron, the major functional unit of the kidney, and its components and what kind of happens in each of those components. But we're going to get into more specifics now. So the urinary system maintains homeostasis by regulating volume and composition of blood. So by exchanging water and ions and substances across membranes in the kidney, across membranes in the nephron, between the blood and the nephron, basically there's just constant exchange. And that exchange depends upon what your body needs or needs to get rid of. To excrete. So you can excrete, your kidneys can excrete solutes and metabolic waste like urea, which is basically a byproduct of protein breakdown. So amino acids are the building blocks of proteins. And as you break down amino acids, your body produces urea, which is a waste product and needs to be excreted. Your kidneys are able to do that. Creatinine is generated by skeletal muscle. By basically breaking down what's called creatine phosphate. Creatine phosphate, the phosphate in creatine phosphate gets donated to ADP to create ATP. And in that process, creatinine gets produced as a byproduct, which can also be excreted by the kidneys. If there's too much being produced or too little being produced, that's an indication that you may have a problem with skeletal muscle. And uric acid, basically by way of recycling nitrogenous bases, so A, T, C, and G from RNA, uric acid can get produced. So there's a chart here that kind of shows you what normal values should be in the plasma versus in the urine. Just as I won't test you on these values, but it's just something there that can be really helpful. In the urine, like for example, glucose in the plasma should be about 70 to 110. Whereas in the urine, it should be less than 0.1, less than 0.01. So it should be extremely low. So the glucose that gets filtered out of your blood should mostly get reabsorbed in a healthy human. And if that's different, or if that value is higher than it should be, that could be an indication that there's something wrong, like diabetes. So we can use these values in the urine versus in the plasma to diagnose disease or illness. And the 3 processes that are undergone in the nephron to form urine are filtration, reabsorption, and secretion. Remember, I said in the capillaries that are the glomerulus, as blood makes its way into the glomerulus, blood gets filtered to clean it out. And what gets filtered out of the blood is the first product of urine, basically. So filtration basically forces water and solutes across the membranes through the glomerular capillaries and into the capsular space. So here's filtration. Blood is forcing water and solutes, like ions and glucose and water, into this. So this would be the capsular space in the renal corpuscle. Well, as that filtrate here makes its way into the renal tubule, the first place it hits is the proximal convoluted tubule, where mostly reabsorption occurs of a lot of the water that made its way out of the glomerulus and into the capsular space. Water gets sent back, and along with water, some transport proteins can send solutes back into the blood. So it says peritubular fluid. This is the fluid, the blood of the peritubular capillaries, right? And tubular fluid is fluid in the renal tubule, just to kind of give you an idea of what the heck we're looking at here. So basically the water and solutes that were once filtered out of the blood get sent back into the blood by way of reabsorption. And then in the distal convoluted tubule, a lot of secretion occurs where solutes and water can then move from the peritubular capillaries into the tubular fluid. So there's several substances that can't get filtered. And if they can't get filtered, out of the blood, they can't make their way into the capsular space. They can't become filtrate, but they can get secreted because of some transporters that are located later in the renal tubule. So a substance that may not be able to be filtered out of the blood and into the nephron, into the capsular space, may be able to get secreted from the peritubular capillaries where blood's located and into that tubular fluid, but just later on in the process. And all of that occurs, filtration, reabsorption, and secretion occurs, basically the balance between reabsorption and secretion varies along nephron regions, and all of that regulates the final volume and the concentration or diluted state of urine. So all of these areas we've talked about, and we're going to kind of go into what occurs in each of those areas. So urine formation occurs in the renal corpuscle to start. About 180 liters per day of filtrate is actually produced. 180 liters. Think about it. If you have a Nalgene bottle or a water bottle that's a liter and you drink a couple of liters a day, you're filtering 180 times of that every single day. Most of that gets reabsorbed. So whatever you filter from the glomerulus to the capsular space in the renal corpuscle, most of that water, organic substances like glucose is a perfect example of an organic substance. 99% to 100% of organic substances like glucose get reabsorbed from where they get filtered. So whatever amount of glucose that gets filtered out of the blood and into the capsular space and then heads into the proximal convoluted tubule, 100% of that gets reabsorbed in a healthy human. So you have a certain amount that you're able to reabsorb in a healthy kidney. But if you have too much glucose, like if you're diabetic and there's way too much glucose in the blood and you filter more blood glucose out, you can only reabsorb so much. So you'll end up excreting some glucose that shouldn't normally be there. That's an indication that there's too much blood glucose in your body and you may have diabetes or something close to, you may be on your way to diabetes. 60 to 70% of the water that gets filtered out of the blood gets sent back into the blood. And that can be quite variable depending on what your body needs. And sodium and chloride ions, most of them, about 60 to 75%, get reabsorbed in the proximal convoluted tubule. In the nephron loop, even more water gets reabsorbed. And along with that goes sodium and chloride ions. So the nephron loop's job is to basically concentrate or dilute urine. It basically creates this concentration gradient in the renal medulla, so that as water and sodium ions and chloride ions get exchanged, the urine within the tubule gets concentrated or diluted, depending on how much water you need to retain or you need to excrete. So if you're dehydrated or overhydrated, your nephron loop can adjust the amount of water and ion concentration in the nephron loop so that you can either excrete water and ions that you don't need if you're overhydrated, or reabsorb it back into the blood if you're dehydrated, so you can hang on to as much water and ion concentration as you can. In the distal convoluted tubule, there's a little bit of reabsorption, but not nearly to the extent of the proximal convoluted tubule. The major job here is secretion. And there's some influence by antidiuretic hormone. There's variable amounts of sodium ions that can be reabsorbed that's influenced by aldosterone. And then in the collecting duct, there is mostly just a little bit of water that can be reabsorbed or not, depending on the influence from antidiuretic hormone. So antidiuretic hormone it has receptors predominantly in the collecting ducts. There's some in the distal portion of the distal convoluted tubule as well. So take a look here. This just kind of summarizes what we just talked about. Reabsorption of water, ions, organic nutrients like glucose. Here's concentration of and dilution of urine depending on water and ion exchange. And then in the distal convoluted tubule, some reabsorption occurs, mostly secretion of drugs and toxins. We'll talk more about as we go. There's under hormonal control like antidiuretic hormone and aldosterone. And then water and ion exchange can occur in the collecting duct as well, and that's under a major influence from antidiuretic hormone and some from aldosterone. So in the renal corpuscle, where there's the renal capsule, the capsular space under the renal capsule, and then the glomerulus. The afferent arteriole is what delivers blood to the renal corpuscle, to the glomerulus basically. The glomerulus is in a ball of capillaries, and between the glomerulus and the glomerular capsule is the capsular space. As blood makes its way from the afferent arteriole into the glomerulus, blood gets filtered, and filtrate leaves the glomerulus and it heads into the capsular space. The blood that continues through the glomerulus makes its way out of the glomerulus and out of the renal corpuscle by way of the efferent arteriole. And there's a set of cells called the juxtaglomerular complex that are very near the renal corpuscle. There's smooth muscle cells that surround the afferent arteriole, and there's a set of cells in the distal convoluted tubule that make up the juxtaglomerular complex that secrete renin when blood pressure in the glomerulus falls. So blood pressure in the kidney is really tightly regulated. So take a look here. So there's the afferent arteriole. Blood is making its way from the cortical radiate artery into the afferent arteriole. Blood flows into the glomerulus, gets filtered, and out into this, the filtrate is sent out into the capsular space, and this is the first part of the proximal convoluted tubule where filtrate leaves and heads into the renal tubule. But as that blood makes its way through the glomerulus, it heads back out of the glomerulus by way of the efferent arteriole. These smooth muscle cells here and these cells of the distal convoluted tubule make up the juxtaglomerular complex that secrete renin if blood pressure in the glomerulus falls. So urine volume, ADH is antidiuretic hormone. So without antidiuretic hormone, no water is reabsorbed in the distal convoluted tubule, that's DCT, or the collecting duct. So basically what happens is the urine has a really low osmotic concentration, but a really high volume. So without antidiuretic hormone, remember antidiuretic hormone, think about what a diuretic is, like caffeine in coffee, it makes you pee. So antidiuretic hormone basically prevents that from happening by creating, by allowing water to be reabsorbed into the blood. So without antidiuretic hormone, you produce a lot of urine, but it's really dilute. Not a lot of solutes. So tons of urine production. So think about urine that would be like clear or really pale yellow. Really a whole bunch of it is produced because you're not reabsorbing water back into the blood. Well, with antidiuretic hormone, so your body gets dehydrated, say remember antidiuretic hormone is a hormone that's produced in the hypothalamus. And as it's produced in the hypothalamus, it gets secreted from the posterior pituitary lobe and then circulates through the blood, binds to receptors in the collecting duct in the distal end of the distal convoluted tubule, and that stimulus of antidiuretic hormone stimulates the production of these water channels. They're called aquaporins that insert into the membrane of the collecting duct and basically allow water from in this tubule to leave and move back into the blood. So you basically reabsorb the water that was in the tubule and don't excrete it, which decreases the volume of urine, but increases its concentration. So urine volume is normally about a little bit more than 1 liter per day, but can vary quite a bit depending on your hydration status. Polyuria is the production of excess amounts of urine, and that can include hormonal or metabolic problems. So usually if you're diabetic, you have a lot of glucose in the urine, and with that goes a lot of water, so you end up peeing a whole lot, urinating a whole lot. I'll use the sciencey word. And then oliguria and anuria basically is without. So without urination is very, very low amounts of urine production. That can indicate really serious kidney problems. But normal is like a clearish to a yellow color. If it's really, really, really dark, you may be dehydrated. And that can vary quite a bit depending on your hydration status and the amount of salt that you eat every day. Depends a lot on your diet and what you've been consuming. So this is just an overview slide of renal function and some really important key points that can be helpful in studying. And a summary, there's a summary figure to show you that as well, where everything is occurring, where exchange is occurring, so reabsorption of water and ions into the blood here, concentration and dilution of urine, and then more reabsorption and exchange and even some secretion here in the distal convoluted tubule, more water exchange. So water is basically exchanged across every part of the renal tubule, but what else gets exchanged is solutes, ions, and things can vary quite a bit. With regard to renal failure, basically kidneys can deteriorate in just a few days. And sudden slowing or stopping of filtration can be caused by drugs. Ischemia is lack of blood flow to the kidney, some obstruction, or even an allergic response to antibiotics can cause major issues. And recovery can be partial or complete depending on how bad it is to begin with. Chronic renal failure basically the progression can be slowed, but it's pretty much not reversible. So kidney damage is really hard to reverse. And management involves restricting water and salt intake and protein intake, so it just puts less strain on your kidney, and that reduces the volume of urine produced and how much needs to be filtered. But along with that, acidosis is a major problem with renal failure, because your kidneys are able to filter acids out of the blood and help maintain pH. And if they're not functioning properly, you can basically induce acidosis, and your body is really not happy about a state of acidic state. Enzymes start to stop functioning properly, and your body can literally start to shut down if your kidneys aren't functioning properly and you become acidotic. We'll talk more about that as we go. Basically, treatment for that is dialysis, or for kidney failure is dialysis, and hemodialysis basically uses an artificial membrane to act like your kidneys, because your kidneys aren't able to function properly. And that just can help basically take the place of your kidney function for you. It's a machine that basically filters your blood for you and filters all the nasty things out of it that aren't supposed to be there, because your kidneys aren't able to do that. And there's just a kind of idea of what that looks like, and how this is an idea of the hemodialysis process. It's really, really taxing on the individual, the human, and it can really wear you out, and it's a long process, can be quite a long process, hours, and can really knock you out for a day or more. It can be really, really exhausting. And then basically to treat acute renal failure, you can regain it as much as 50% with treatment, but chronic renal failure, you can slow the progression, but you can't stop it. And dialysis basically just relieves symptoms and signs, but it's not a cure. A transplant is the only real cure for severe renal failure. And there's a really high success rate if you're compliant and you're doing what your doctors tell you to do, and trying to stay healthy after that, after replacement has occurred. So it can be really serious, but it can be treatable if you catch it early. And so that's it for the second section here. I will see you in the next part. So we've got 3 more to go. See you soon.